A deafening roar shatters the midnight silence of Lake Superior, followed by a heat so intense it cracks the very granite meant to last forever. This was the moment the loneliest place on Earth became a pillar of fire. Inside, the 110-foot granite fortress was dissolving into a white-hot furnace. Outside, the sub-zero abyss of the Great Lakes waited to swallow anyone who dared to leap. How does a monument built for salvation transform into a tomb of stone and steel? Was it a hidden mechanical flaw, a single fatal decision, or the psychological weight of an isolation so deep it broke the men before the fire did? The smoke has long since cleared, but the forensic evidence tells a story far darker than the official reports suggest. Why did the survivors claim they weren't alone on that ledge? What secrets are still locked behind the charred iron doors of the loneliest place on Earth? Stay with us as we reconstruct the final hours of Stannard Rock, because the truth is buried much deeper than the wreckage. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world, holding roughly 13% of the planet's surface freshwater. The Ojibwe called it Gichigami, the Great Sea, while French explorers named it Lac Supérieur. Regardless of the name, its nature remained constant, vast, powerful, and unforgiving. For centuries, indigenous tribes navigated these waters with respect, but large-scale commercial traffic only surged after May 1855, when the opening of the Soo Locks at Sault Ste. Marie connected Lake Superior to the lower Great Lakes. By the post-Civil War era, the lake had been transformed into the world's busiest industrial highway. It became a vital artery, fueled by a raw hunger for the iron ore and copper deposits of the Marquette Range and the Quinault Peninsula. The raw materials for Chicago's first skyscrapers and the rails that pushed the American frontier to the Pacific all moved through these cold waters. However, this industrial progress faced a lethal obstacle discovered in 1835 by Captain Charles C. Stannard. Known as Stannard Rock, it is the jagged summit of a gargantuan submerged mountain, a geological relic of the mid-continental rift system forged over 1 billion years ago. While the surrounding lake floor plunges into a pressurized abyss nearly 1,000 feet deep, this granite peak rises with terrifying suddenness to sit just 2 to 4 feet beneath the waterline. This billion-year-old plateau of obsidian hard stone is a geological trap of the highest order, remaining utterly invisible to the naked eye until a ship's hull is shredded by its prehistoric teeth. Because heavily laden freighters were forced to navigate a narrow corridor near these coordinates to reach the safety of the locks, Stannard Rock sat as an invisible killer directly in the path of American progress, waiting for any vessel that strayed too close to its jagged edge. Before the first stone of the lighthouse was ever laid in 1882, the rock functioned as a silent, invisible executioner, earning a dark reputation shrouded in what superstitious sailors called the lighthouse curse. The maritime records of the mid-19th century serve as a grim ledger of shattered timber and lost souls, documenting a cycle of destruction that seemed almost intentional. The most infamous harbinger of the reef's cruelty was the disaster of the SS John Locke in 1866. The granite reef acted like a giant prehistoric rasp, dismantling the ship's wooden structure piece by piece with every surge of the swell, leaving its crew at the mercy of a lake that, as the legend goes, famously never gives up its dead. Between 1,860 and 1,870, maritime historians estimate that dozens of unaccounted disappearances in the Central Superior Basin ships that vanished without a distress signal or a single floating spar can be traced back to this single, lethal point of contact. Stannard Rock became a profound maritime graveyard where the debris of industrial progress was scattered across the silty, freezing floor. Mariners of the era claimed that the sheer magnetism of the iron-rich granite caused compasses to spin erratically, and that fog would materialize with such sudden, unnatural density. It felt as if the lake itself were attempting to swallow the very light of day. By 1873, the U.S. Lighthouse Board was forced to confront a grim reality. Temporary measures, like buoys or lightships, were essentially a death sentence for any crew stationed at the treacherous coordinates of Stannard Rock. The brutal winter ice flows of Lake Superior, moving with the crushing force of tectonic plates, could shatter reinforced wooden hulls like eggshells, demanding nothing less than a permanent, immovable sentinel, a structure forged from the same indestructible stone as the reef itself. This was no longer a simple matter of maritime safety. It had escalated into a high-stakes declaration of war against the elements to protect the economic engine of a rebuilding United States. To lead this charge, the board enlisted General Orlando Poe, a legendary Civil War engineer and former chief of staff to General Sherman, whose strategic brilliance was now called upon to wage a different, more grueling campaign against the relentless hydraulic forces of the North. In 1877, Congress appropriated $50,000 to begin construction of a lighthouse. In 1878, construction formally began. The crews and much of the equipment that had built Spectacle Reef were transferred to Lake Superior. A construction camp was established near Skagne, Michigan, 51 miles southwest of the reef. They called it Stannardsville. It included barracks, offices, workshops, docks, and storage facilities. This was not a small, seasonal project. It was an industrial operation staged against one of the harshest bodies of water in North America. The first challenge was the foundation. Engineers selected a portion of the reef that lay approximately 12 feet below the lake's surface. On that submerged rock, they would construct a massive circular crib 62.5 feet in diameter. To create it, workers placed a wrought iron casing around the perimeter of the future foundation, fitting it tightly against the contours of the stone. The structure was lined with canvas. Oakum fibers traditionally used in shipbuilding was packed beneath the bottom edge to create a watertight. Then they pumped the water out. Imagine that scene. In open Lake Superior, waves breaking around them, men standing inside an iron ring on a submerged reef, forcing back the lake long enough to build. Once the interior was dry, the exposed rock was cleaned and prepared. Concrete was poured ton after ton until a solid foundation rose 35 feet high from the lake bed. This was not a simple platform. This was a defensive base designed to resist ice pressure, wave impact, and decades of freeze-thaw cycles. While the crib was taking shape, another operation unfolded hundreds of miles away. The tower's sandstone blocks were quarried at Kelly's Island on Lake Erie. Each block weighed between 12 and 30 tons. The tower was first assembled on shore at Stannardsville to ensure that every stone fit perfectly. Each course was measured. Each joint was tested. Only after engineers were satisfied with the alignment was the entire structure disassembled, block by block, and transported by barge to Stannard Rock. There, over the course of 2 months, the tower was rebuilt atop the completed foundation. Massive iron drift pins were driven vertically through the stones, locking each block to the one beneath it. This added tensile strength to the immense compressive weight of the masonry. But work could only take place between May and October. Every winter, Lake Superior reclaimed the site with ice and violent storms. Each spring, crews returned to repair damage before continuing construction. Even during summer months, weather halted progress repeatedly. The 1878-1879 season proved especially brutal. Crews were able to work only 61% of the time. The rest was lost to wind, waves, and conditions too dangerous to continue. Still, they pressed forward. In total, construction took more than 5 years. By the time the project was completed, it had cost over $300,000, an extraordinary sum in the late 19th century. The materials tell the story of scale: 7,276 tons of concrete, 1,270 tons of tower stone, 76 tons of brick, and 126 tons of iron. Every pound transported, positioned, and secured in open water. When finished, the structure stood as one of the most remarkable engineering feats in the United States at the time. A 78-foot tower rising from a 35-foot base, anchored to a reef that had once been invisible and deadly. Walls 7.5 feet thick at the base, tapering as they climbed toward the lantern room, a stone sentinel in the middle of a freshwater sea. However, a tower is only as effective as its eye, and to crown this engineering masterpiece, the board installed a first-order Fresnel lens, the jewel of the tower and the absolute pinnacle of 19th century optical engineering. Standing nearly 12 feet high and weighing several tons, this lens was a complex, shimmering honeycomb of hundreds of hand-ground glass prisms set in a massive, polished brass frame. Its genius lay in its ability to capture nearly every stray ray of light from a simple, flickering oil lamp and concentrate them into a singular, piercing horizontal beam that sliced through the thickest superior fogs and darkest storms, visible for over 18 nautical miles. The completion of the tower was hailed globally as one of the greatest engineering triumphs in American history. Frequently compared by contemporaries to the building of the Great Pyramids or the Great Wall of China, due to the sheer isolation and extreme environmental hostility involved in its creation. Stannard Rock Lighthouse was first illuminated on the 4th of July 1882 as the final construction vessels vanished beneath the horizon and the triumphant echoes dedication ceremony were swallowed by the vast expanse of Lake Superior. The Stannard Rock Lighthouse began its true existence not as a mere navigational aid, but as a grueling psychological pressure cooker. Anchored 39 miles from the nearest human heartbeat, this 110-foot granite shaft stood as a vertical island in a freshwater sea, a place where the linear progression of time was discarded in favor of the unpredictable, relentless rhythm of the Great Lakes. The official duty roster, dictated by the Lighthouse Board, mandated a cycle of 3 weeks at sea, followed by 1 week of shore leave. However, on the open waters of Superior, these schedules were nothing more than fragile suggestions. Each season, the lighthouse operated from spring until early December. When ice locked the shipping lanes, the keepers left. They returned when the thaw allowed vessels to move again, typically between March and May. But returning was not as simple as unlocking a door. At the start of each season, thick layers of ice, sometimes 2 feet deep or more, encased the structure. The men had to use sledgehammers and pickaxes to clear the entry just to get inside. This was not symbolic labor. It was hours, sometimes days of exhausting, dangerous work in freezing wind. One storm in 1913 remains legendary. The tower became entombed in approximately 12 feet of ice. 12 feet. It took a team of 12 men, armed with pickaxes and steam pipes, an entire week to chip and melt their way through the frozen mass and free the keepers trapped inside. Imagine the psychological weight of that moment, sealed inside a stone cylinder, encased in ice thicker than a single-story room. Turnover at Stannard Rock was high. Many men lasted only a short time before transferring to more hospitable stations. To encourage volunteers, the lighthouse service often allowed keepers to choose their next assignment after completing duty at Stannard Rock. It was understood. Serve your time here, and you earn your reward elsewhere. Still, some men remained for years. Lewis Wills of Marquette served as head keeper from 1936 to 1956, the longest tenure in the station's history. He also set the record for the longest continuous stay, 99 days without relief. His assistant, Elmer Saran, remained assigned to the station from 1934 to 1954. These were not short-term adventurers. These were men who learned to live with isolation as a constant companion. The wind never truly stopped, even on calm days. There was the endless pulse of water against stone. During storms, the roar became deafening waves, smashing, iron fittings rattling, fog whistles droning into the gray horizon. Supplies were limited. Meals relied heavily on canned goods and preserved meat. Fresh food was rare. Entertainment consisted of books from the small library, letters from home that might arrive weeks late, and endless games of solitaire. Isolation does something to the human mind. Weeks could pass without seeing another face beyond the three men assigned beside you. Communication with the outside world, for most of the lighthouse's history, depended on visual signals from passing ships. If illness struck, if injury occurred, if equipment failed, help could be days or even weeks away. When the supply boats were battered back by towering sub-zero swells, the keepers were left to stare at a vacant, gray horizon, becoming literal prisoners of a fortress that provided structural safety but offered zero emotional comfort. Life within the narrow, circular masonry walls was a profound sensory paradox, a world defined by shattering silence that was regularly punctuated by industrial-grade auditory assault. During the dense, impenetrable fogs that haunt the central basin, the tower's massive steam-powered foghorns would erupt every 60 seconds with a roar so tectonic it literally rattled the marrow in the men's bones, making sustained conversation, coherent thought, or restorative sleep a physical impossibility. This relentless auditory torture, when combined with the claustrophobic, light-starved living quarters, birthed the dreaded stir-crazy syndrome. While modern clinical psychology identifies this state as extreme confinement stress, a breakdown of the psyche caused by prolonged environmental monotony and social isolation, 19th century sailors recognized it by a much more visceral name: lighthouse madness. Men who arrived at the start of their shifts as close friends and camaraderie-bound colleagues would often descend into a stony, resentful silence within a matter of weeks. The friction of forced proximity in such a high-stakes, low-escape environment triggered deep-seated clinical depressions and, in many documented instances, led to volatile, explosive outbursts over the smallest perceived slights. The psychological toll of being stationed at Stannard Rock was so profound that maritime historians frequently draw direct parallels between this 19th century isolation and the modern protocols designed for astronauts aboard the International Space Station. Much like those in orbit, the keepers of the rock were confined to a fragile life support pod surrounded by a lethal vacuum. The only difference was that their vacuum consisted of a quadrillion gallons of sub-zero water rather than the void of space. They were the original long-duration explorers, testing the limits of human endurance in a world that never stopped trying to kill them. Before electrification, the light itself demanded constant attention. For decades, it was fueled by various flammable illuminants. The lens had to be cleaned meticulously, wicks trimmed, Mechanisms maintained. A mistake meant darkness, and darkness here meant danger for ships carrying thousands of tons of cargo. In 1944, the station was finally electrified. Generators and a battery array were installed. A 500-watt light bulb replaced the older oil vapor lamp, and a small motor rotated the lens. The work became less physically taxing in some respects, but the isolation did not change. The wind did not change. The ice did not change. Through the 1940s and 1950s, automation was spreading across the world. Lighthouse stations, once symbols of heroic solitude, were gradually becoming mechanical outposts. By the summer of 1961, Stannard Rock's days as a manned station were numbered. The lighthouse service had already determined that this would be its final season with a resident crew. After nearly 80 years of continuous human presence, the tower was preparing to stand alone. To prepare for that transition, a 23-year-old electrician's mate named Oscar Daniels was assigned to the station. His task was straightforward in theory: repair a generator and ready the systems for full automation the following season. He joined the existing crew during what would unknowingly become the final chapter of human life on Stannard Rock. On the morning of the 18th of June 1961, the station was under the command of 34-year-old boatswain's mate Walter M. Patterson, though Patterson himself was on leave that day. In his absence, 3 men were operating the lighthouse: 35-year-old engineman First Class William Maxwell, 22-year-old seaman Walter Scobie, and 18-year-old seaman Richard Horn. Oscar Daniels worked alongside them. By 1961, life at the lighthouse was more comfortable than it had been in earlier decades. The men had electric lighting, they had a refrigerator, they had a radio. There was even a small television set. But comfort did not erase danger. The tower still stored large quantities of fuel to power generators. Approximately 1,000 gallons, more than 3,000. 700 liters of gasoline were kept on site to sustain operations. By the evening of the 18th of June 1961, the atmosphere within the massive granite walls was deceptively mundane, a typical blend of routine maintenance, the metallic scent of industrial grease, and the low, resonant hum of generators that provided the only spark of modernity in their 19th century fortress. However, beneath the polished floorboards and within the unventilated subterranean chambers at the tower's base, a catastrophic failure was unfolding in silence. A slow, undetected leak from the massive fuel storage tanks had been bleeding volatile gasoline and kerosene vapors into the stagnant air of the lower levels. In terms of pure forensic physics, the very structural perfection that General Orlando Poe had engineered to make the tower eternal now conspired to transform it into a lethal pressure vessel. Because the tower was constructed of non-porous, interlocking granite blocks bonded by heavy iron bolts, it possessed a staggering compressive strength that lacked any capacity for lateral expansion. Unlike a steel structure that might buckle and vent energy, or a wooden frame that would splinter and release pressure, these stone walls created a perfectly sealed combustion chamber. When a stray spark, likely from a generator or a light switch, finally made contact with a concentrated fuel-air mixture at approximately 9:30 p.m., the laws of thermodynamics dictated a violent, vertical outcome. With no path for lateral escape through the invincible stone, the kinetic energy was forced into the only available conduit, the 110-foot vertical shaft of the lighthouse itself. The tower effectively became a massive, stone-barreled cannon. The explosion acted as a piston, driving a wall of fire and concussive force upward with terrifying velocity. erupting through the living quarters and the lantern room from the inside out. The blast was so focused that it behaved with the characteristics of a high explosive charge, vaporizing everything in its immediate path and superheating the interior air to temperatures that would melt lead. The devastation was instantaneous and absolute. The force was violent enough to throw Walter Scobie from his bunk on the fourth deck. The blast surged upward through the structure, carrying heat, smoke, and flame with it. The explosion ignited the stored gasoline and triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. Flames engulfed the generator area. The propane storage ignited. Coal reserves in the lower levels contributed additional fuel. What had been a lighthouse became, in seconds, a furnace. The shockwave tore through interior spaces. Doors splintered. One heavy wooden door was blown off its hinges and struck Oscar Daniels, shattering his legs. He fell, dazed, and critically injured. Smoke filled the air. The tower that had stood against 30-foot waves now trembled from internal fire. Walter Scobie, stunned but conscious, moved immediately. He raced down 2 levels through smoke and chaos to find his fellow crewmen. He found Oscar on the floor, injured and barely able to move. There was no time to debate options. The fire was spreading. The tower was filling with black smoke. Miraculously, the thick, storm-resistant windows designed to withstand gale-force winds had blown outward in the blast. What would normally have been a protective barrier now became their only escape route. The men maneuvered Oscar toward the opening. They climbed out through shattered glass and onto the exterior ledge. From there, they scaled down along piping toward the base of the crib. Behind them, thick black smoke poured upward from the lantern tower. The stone sentinel now resembled an industrial chimney, belching a column visible for miles. But as they reached the relative safety of the crib, Walter realized something chilling. 2 men were missing. William Maxwell had been working in the lower levels near the generator room when the explosion occurred. Survival in that space would have been nearly impossible. Maxwell, a 35-year-old father of 2, was likely killed instantly. Richard Horne, meanwhile, had acted on instinct. The lighthouse maintained a small wooden boat, its only immediate means of evacuation. Believing that boat was their only chance of escape, Richard, still dizzy from the blast, dove into the water. The temperature of Lake Superior that morning hovered near 40 degrees F. At that temperature, cold shock can incapacitate a swimmer in minutes. Muscles stiffen. Breathing becomes erratic. Strength drains rapidly. From the crib, Walter Scobie saw Richard swimming desperately toward the drifting wreckage. The current was pulling it farther away. He shouted to him, "You'll never catch it." But panic and adrenaline can drown out reason. Richard's strokes weakened. He began to falter. For a moment, it appeared that the explosion would claim a second life. Walter grabbed a life ring and hurled it toward him. The first throw missed. He tried again. This time, the ring struck Richard's hand. He grasped it, and Walter pulled him back toward the ladder. Together, they hauled him from the freezing water. When the flames finally began to die down on the 18th of June 1961, Stannard Rock was no longer a functioning lighthouse. The explosion had destroyed the station's radio equipment. For approximately 3 hours, the fire burned intensely inside the tower. Thick black smoke poured into the sky, visible for miles across Lake Superior. Even after the main flames subsided, the structure continued to smolder for days. The heat had been so extreme that parts of the surrounding limestone showed signs of severe damage. What had once been a beacon of guidance now looked like an industrial chimney rising from open water. On the crib below, 3 men remained alive: Walter Scobie, Richard Horne, and Oscar Daniels, injured, exhausted, and stranded. They had no working radio, no operational boat, no immediate way to reach shore. William Maxwell was gone. presumed killed instantly in the blast near the generator room. The reality settled in quickly. Rescue would not come unless someone happened to see the smoke. They took stock of their situation. Supplies were nearly non-existent. Inside the damaged structure, most provisions had been destroyed or rendered inaccessible. What they managed to recover was painfully inadequate. 2 bottles of ketchup and a single can of beans. That was it. They found a tarp and rigged a makeshift shelter along the south side of the crib, using what remained intact to block wind as best they could. Lake Superior did not pause for tragedy. The wind still cut across the stone platform. The water temperature remained near 40 degrees F. Daylight offered exposure. Night brought cold and darkness. 39 miles away at the Coast Guard station in Marquette, lookouts watched with rising, cold terror as the Eye of Superior suddenly blinked out of existence. They desperately attempted to re-establish contact through every available frequency. But as a fierce late spring storm began to whip the lake into a frenzy of whitecaps and 10-foot swells, a harrowing reality set in. No rescue vessel in the fleet could survive the surge to investigate the outage. As evening fell on June 18, Walter Scobie climbed partway up the tower, navigating through smoke and debris, and positioned himself near the damaged lantern room. Using a flashlight, he began sending SOS signals through the lens, 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, again and again into the night. Over the 72 hours following the explosion, the psychological torture was perhaps even more agonizing than the physical pain. They sat in forced silence as they watched the distant lights of massive ore freighters pass by on the horizon. The sailors on those ships completely unaware that a desperate drama was unfolding on the dark pillar they were passing. June 19 passed. The smoke column thinned but still rose. They rationed what little food they had. Daniels endured shattered legs with no medical care beyond what the others could improvise. Horn, still weakened from his plunge into the icy lake, fought exhaustion. Every hour felt longer than the last. To stay alive, the 3 men entered into a desperate pact. They would never let each other fall asleep, because they knew that if they allowed their eyes to close, the creeping lethargy of hypothermia would ensure they never woke up. This buddy system of survival was their only defense against the shattering silence of the lake. To anchor their minds against the crushing despair of their isolation, they shared vivid, detailed stories of their lives on the mainland, the names of their children, the smell of home-cooked meals, and plans for a future that seemed increasingly unreachable. They discussed the technical failures of the day, analyzing the blast with the detached precision of men who had spent their lives maintaining machinery, but always returning to the human connection that was now their only lifeline. When the Coast Guard cutter Woodrush finally broke through the receding storm swells on the 3rd day of the 1,961 rescue operation, its arrival did far more than pull 3 broken men from the brink of death. It marked the definitive, somber end of a maritime era that had lasted nearly a century. As Maxwell, Horn, and Daniels were lifted from that blood-stained, soot-covered concrete ledge, the United States Coast Guard was forced to confront a grim, undeniable realization. The logistical complexity and, more importantly, the psychological toll of manning Stannard Rock, a place that had proven it could transform from a maritime sanctuary into a stone tomb in a single explosive heartbeat, was no longer a cost the nation was willing to pay. By 1962, less than a year after the catastrophic blast, the human element was permanently purged from the tower. The flickering oil lamps and the constant presence of human watchmen were phased out, making the loneliest place on Earth, the very first of the Great Lakes' isolated staging lights to be fully automated, replacing human grit with the cold, unblinking efficiency of solar panels and electric beacons. Today, 150 years after Orlando Poe's massive granite blocks were first bolted into the billion-year-old reef, the Stannard Rock Lighthouse remains a stoic, scarred monument to Victorian-era ambition. It no longer requires a human heart to beat within its stone shaft to keep the light burning. Instead, the tower has been repurposed as a sophisticated meteorological research station, serving as the primary hub for the Great Lakes Evaporation Network. Its galleries, once paced by weary keepers, are now bristling with high-precision sensors that measure wind velocity and water temperatures with forensic accuracy. Scientists now monitor the rock from the absolute safety of air-conditioned offices hundreds of miles away, receiving encrypted data streams in real time via satellite. The tower has survived over a century of gales of November, outlasting the very ships it was built to protect, and every man who once called its circular rooms home. Its granite exterior, though pitted by the 1961 explosion and weathered by 100 winters of relentless ice encasement, remains as structurally sound as the day the last stone was set, a testament to an era when we built things to outlast time itself. However, this seamless transition to automation raises a profound and haunting philosophical question about the evolution of our maritime history. The modern world offers a clinical efficiency and safety that General Poe could only have dreamed of. Satellites and GPS have reduced the invisible executioner of the reef to a mere set of coordinates on a digital screen. But in replacing the keepers with silicon sensors, we have quietly severed the human connection to the abyss. A circuit board can detect barometric pressure, but it can never feel the crushing, soul-deep weight of isolation. A microprocessor cannot make a pact of brotherhood to stay awake against the creeping, lethal lethargy of hypothermia, nor can it offer a whispered word of hope to a dying comrade. The story of that final night was not merely a mechanical failure. It remains the definitive record of the moment we realized that even our most magnificent engineering triumphs remain at the mercy of the primordial elements. Stannard Rock stands today as a silent, automated monument, yet the echoes of those 72 hours of suffering and survival still resonate through the cold winds that blow across the lake. Can an algorithm ever truly understand the staggering weight of responsibility for the lives of every sailor lost in the storm, in the visceral, heartbeat-to-heartbeat way that William Bryan and his crew did? As the sun sets over the vast, cold expanse of Lake Superior, and the automated light begins its solitary, rhythmic pulse, we look back to honor the legacy of those who stood guard at the very edge of the world. Stannard Rock houses a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration (NOAA) weather station. Data collected there feeds into national forecasting systems that guide navigation, aviation, and storm preparedness across the United States. In a new way, the lighthouse still protects lives, no longer by a rotating lens alone, but through information transmitted across satellites and networks. In 2015, ownership of the structure was officially transferred to the Superior Watershed Partnership. Their mission is preservation. After more than 140 years of punishment from wind, water, and ice, Stannard Rock is no longer simply a navigational aid. It is a historic landmark, a monument to a different era. Finally, before closing today's message, thank you for standing watch with us at the edge of the world. The legacy of Stannard Rock is not just written in granite, but in the stories of the men who braved the abyss. If you have your own stories or thoughts on this maritime tragedy, I invite you to share them in the comments below. Your voices are what truly keep this history alive. If this journey into the heart of the Great Lakes moved you, please like, share, and follow to join our crew for future expeditions into the deep. Until our next voyage into the mysteries of the sea, I will see you in the next video on our channel. Stay safe on the water, my friends.